He did not hesitate when he said it, and he did not attempt to soften the truth or reshape it into something easier to accept. Because the way he looked at her made it clear that this was not a confession driven by doubt, but a decision he had already accepted long before this moment. He told her he was in love with someone else, and the words carried a steady certainty that made them heavier than if he had struggled to say them. What made it irreversible was not the confession itself, but the name that followed, because that name did not belong to a stranger, and did not belong to someone distant enough to remain abstract. It belonged to her sister. Marissa did not cry, and she did not react in the way most people would have in that moment, because there was no visible collapse in her expression, no raised voice, and no immediate attempt to interrupt or question what he had just said. Instead, something quieter settled over her, something controlled and deliberate, as if her mind had already begun reorganizing everything she knew while he was still finishing the sentence. She allowed a faint smile to appear, not because there was anything about the moment that deserved it, but because she understood something he did not yet realize, which was that this moment was not going to break her. This moment was going to clarify everything. She reached for her phone without rushing, unlocking it with steady hands, her movements precise and unshaken, as if this were simply another decision she had already made, rather than one she was making in real time. She opened her messages, scrolled to Kayla's name, and typed 3 words that carried more weight than anything that had been said out loud in that room. She sent a message that contained only one statement, and that statement changed the balance of the situation immediately. "I know everything." She pressed send without hesitation, then placed the phone face down on the table, ending the action as cleanly as she had begun it. He watched her, and for the first time since he had started speaking, something shifted in his expression, because whatever response he had prepared for, this had not been part of it. Later, he would admit that when that message appeared on Kayla's phone, the reaction was immediate and visible in a way that could not be controlled, because the color drained from her face and whatever confidence she had relied on disappeared in a single moment. That reaction mattered more than anything else because it confirmed what Marissa had already understood. What they believed they had hidden was no longer hidden. What they believed was protected was already beginning to collapse under its own weight. If anyone believed this story would follow a predictable path, they would be mistaken, because this was not the end of something that had already been damaged. This was the beginning of something that would be handled with intention. Marissa Grayson had built her life with a level of precision that left little room for chaos, and that precision had not come naturally, but had been developed over years of working in an environment where mistakes carried consequences and clarity mattered more than comfort. Her career in financial consulting had trained her to identify patterns, to recognize inconsistencies before they became problems, and to make decisions without allowing emotion to interfere with the outcome. That way of thinking had extended into her personal life, shaping the way she approached relationships, routines, and expectations without her fully realizing it. Her marriage had been part of that structure. It was not dramatic, and it was not the kind of relationship that demanded attention from the outside, but it was stable in a way that most people quietly hope for without ever quite achieving. Derek Grayson had always been predictable in the ways that matter, avoiding unnecessary conflict, maintaining routines, and existing within a structure that felt reliable rather than volatile. They had spent more than a decade building something that felt grounded, something that did not require constant reassurance to exist. Their home reflected that same stability. It stood in a quiet residential neighborhood where everything appeared consistent, where neighbors acknowledged each other without asking too many questions, and where life moved in a rhythm that rarely shifted without warning. Their evenings followed that pattern: simple dinners, shared conversations, and routines that created a sense of continuity rather than intensity. They would sit together, sometimes talking about work, sometimes about plans that did not seem important at the time, and sometimes about nothing at all, filling the space with a familiarity that felt dependable. There was nothing in that life that demanded attention, nothing that suggested something had already begun to shift beneath the surface. Her younger sister, Kayla Mercer, had always existed as part of that structure, close enough to remain a constant presence, but independent enough to maintain her own life. Kayla had always been different. She moved through situations more quickly, made decisions more directly, and reacted without the hesitation Marissa relied on. Their relationship had not always been easy, because there had been tension growing up that neither of them had ever fully addressed. But over time, they had found a way to exist in each other's lives without reopening those conflicts. Their weekly meetings had become routine. Long lunches that stretched into hours, conversations that moved easily between trivial details, and moments of honesty that felt almost accidental. Derek fit into that dynamic without effort. He and Kayla shared a similar rhythm in conversation, a similar sense of humor, and an ease that Marissa had once seen as a sign that everything in her life was aligned the way it should be. She had believed that the people who mattered most could exist in the same space without friction. She had believed that nothing sat out of place. The first shift was small enough that it could have been ignored completely. It happened on an ordinary evening when Marissa returned home earlier than expected because a meeting had been canceled. The house was quiet, but not empty. She heard Derek's voice before she saw him, coming from the kitchen in a tone that did not match what she was used to hearing. It was softer than usual, more contained, and carried a level of familiarity that felt different. She paused, not because she was suspicious, but because something about it did not fit. When she stepped into the kitchen, he turned too quickly, his expression adjusting in a way that lasted only a fraction of a second before it disappeared. He smiled and said it was Kayla. He handed her the phone without hesitation. Kayla sounded exactly the way she always did, relaxed and casual, moving through the conversation without any indication that something beneath the surface had changed. They spoke for a few minutes about nothing that required attention, discussing plans for the weekend and a restaurant Kayla wanted to try. Everything sounded normal, and yet something had already shifted. It felt like standing in a familiar space that had been changed just enough to feel different, even if nothing obvious stood out. Marissa dismissed it at first because there was no reason not to. But once the thought existed, it did not disappear. It stayed, and it sharpened. Derek's habits began to change in ways that were easy to explain individually, but difficult to ignore when they were seen together. He kept his phone closer. He carried it with him more often. He changed routines that had once been automatic. Kayla became less available, canceling plans with explanations that always made sense on their own. Marissa did not confront it. She did not ask questions. She did not search for answers that might not yet exist in a form she could use. She observed. She waited. She paid attention to patterns rather than isolated moments. And when the moment finally came, she did not need him to explain anything, because she already understood what he was about to say, and more importantly, she understood what she was going to do next. He said her name first, quietly, as if that alone might soften what was coming. But the steadiness in his voice made it clear that this was not a moment he was unsure about, and not something he was still deciding. The house felt unusually still around them, as if every familiar sound had stepped back to make space for what he was about to say, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerator and the slow, steady breathing of the dog asleep beneath the table. Marissa held her glass without lifting it, her fingers resting lightly against the stem, her posture unchanged, her attention fixed entirely on him in a way that made the silence stretch longer than he expected. When he spoke again, he did not hesitate. He said he was in love with Kayla. He did not try to reduce it or explain it away, and he did not attempt to frame it as something recent or accidental. He said it had been going on for years, not something that had developed suddenly, but something that had existed alongside their marriage without interruption. The number came last, delivered in the same steady tone, as if it were simply a detail instead of the thing that would define everything else. 5 years. The meaning did not land all at once, but unfolded gradually, forcing itself into clarity instead of arriving as a single impact. 5 years meant birthdays that had never been what they seemed. 5 years meant holidays layered over something hidden. 5 years meant conversations that had carried a different reality beneath them. 5 years meant there had never been a version of her marriage that existed without this. There had been no clean beginning, and there had been no version untouched by what he had just revealed. Only a reality she had misunderstood from the start. She expected a reaction, something immediate and emotional, something that would match the scale of what had just been said. Instead, what settled over her was clarity, the kind that forms instantly when everything aligns at once. It felt like a puzzle she had been assembling without realizing it had finally locked into place. She looked at him for a long moment, not the way she had looked at him before, but as if she were seeing him without the assumptions she had carried for years. Then she smiled, not with warmth or forgiveness, but with recognition. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for her phone and unlocked it with a movement so controlled it felt automatic. She scrolled once, found Kayla's name, and paused just long enough to choose the exact words she needed. There was no hesitation in the action. She typed 3 words and sent them. "I know everything." She placed the phone face down on the table with deliberate precision, as if the action itself marked the end of one version of her life and the beginning of another. Derek watched her closely, and for the first time since he had started speaking, something shifted in his expression, confusion appearing first, followed by something less defined, something closer to unease. Whatever response he had prepared for, this had not been part of it. Marissa stood up without asking permission to end the conversation and walked past him without slowing down, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, her focus already somewhere else entirely. He did not follow her. Later, she heard movement in the hallway and the quiet sound of a door closing in a different room, a separation that happened without discussion, as if both of them understood that whatever space they had shared no longer existed in the same way. That night, she lay awake, not because she was unable to sleep, but because sleep would have required distance from a level of awareness she was not willing to lose. The ceiling above her remained the same, the room unchanged, the house silent in a way that no longer felt familiar. She did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because the pain had already been reorganized into something more structured, something that did not demand expression in the way she had expected. Somewhere between the moment he spoke and the moment she left the table, something fundamental had shifted. This was not the end of her life. It was the end of an illusion she had been living inside. That distinction mattered more than anything else. She turned onto her side and allowed her thoughts to move without interruption, not avoiding them and not trying to soften them, allowing everything she had dismissed to resurface with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. Every canceled plan, every slight change in tone, every moment that had felt just slightly out of place but easy to rationalize at the time. Now they connected. Now they made sense. At some point in the early hours, she stopped looking backward, because there was nothing left there that required interpretation. Instead, she shifted forward, not emotionally, but practically. She began to build a structure in her mind, piece by piece, separating what mattered from what did not, and organizing the reality of her life in terms that could be acted on rather than felt. Their marriage had lasted more than a decade. The house had been purchased years into that timeline. Both names on the deed, both financially responsible, both tied to something that could not simply be walked away from. Their savings were not abstract. They were specific, measurable, accumulated with intention over time, originally meant for a future that no longer existed. Her own accounts were stable. His business was not separate from her in the way she had once assumed. In the early years when things were uncertain, she had signed documents, backed decisions, and taken on risk without fully mapping the long-term implications. Her name was attached in places she had not revisited in years. That realization changed the nature of the situation completely. This was no longer just betrayal. This was exposure. By the time the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, she had already made the only decision that mattered. She was not going to react. She was going to respond. She got out of bed at the same time she always did, moved through the house with the same routine she had followed for years, the familiarity grounding her in a way that emotion could not. The coffee machine clicked on and filled the kitchen with a quiet, steady rhythm that felt almost detached from everything that had happened hours earlier. Then she opened her laptop. She did not hesitate. She accessed their joint account and moved exactly half of the balance into her personal account, not out of panic or anger, but out of precision. It was not everything, and it was not an overreach. It was balance. Her hands remained steady as she entered the amount, confirmed the transfer, and watched it process without interruption. The absence of hesitation surprised her more than anything else. Fear was there, but it was controlled, contained, useful. Because fear, when understood correctly, does not stop you. It directs you. And in that moment, what it directed her toward was simple: protect what is still yours. By the time Derek came downstairs, the house had already shifted into something else entirely. He looked like someone who had not slept, his movements slower, his expression tighter, as if he was still trying to anticipate a reaction that had not yet come. He said they should talk. Marissa did not argue, and she did not raise her voice. She did not give him what he expected. She told him they would talk, but not like this, not here, and not without structure. The next conversation would not be emotional, it would be legal. He started to respond, then stopped, the words failing to form in a way that would give him back any control over the situation. And just like that, the dynamic between them shifted. After he left, the silence in the house felt different. Not empty. Cleared. Marissa sat back down, opened a new tab, and began searching for a divorce attorney. Not as someone reacting to betrayal, but as someone already moving into the next phase of her life. She did not look for just any attorney, and she did not approach the process the way most people do when emotion is still driving their decisions. Because by that point, Marissa had already separated what had happened from what needed to happen next. What Derek and Kayla had done belonged to one category, and what she was going to do next belonged to another. And that distinction was what gave her control. She searched carefully, narrowing her options to someone who understood complex assets, someone who could move through financial structures without being distracted by personal narrative. Because she understood that emotion, if allowed to lead, would only weaken what she was trying to build. Once she found the right attorney, everything shifted from reaction into structure. And from that moment forward, every decision followed a pattern that was deliberate rather than impulsive. The discovery did not arrive with confrontation, and it did not appear as a sudden reveal that changed everything at once. It unfolded quietly, almost patiently, in the middle of something that felt procedural and controlled. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the house was empty in a way that made it easier to move through without interruption. Marissa had given herself a task that required focus rather than interpretation, moving from room to room with her phone, documenting assets the way her attorney had advised. Furniture, electronics, and anything of value that might matter later were recorded carefully, each item captured in a way that removed uncertainty from the process. The work was repetitive, but that repetition was useful because it gave her something stable to hold on to while everything else was shifting. Derek's office was the last space on her list, and she entered it without hesitation, scanning the room with the same steady attention she had applied everywhere else. She was not looking for anything specific. She was completing the task. The closet sat against the far wall, partially hidden behind a sliding door, and the top shelf held a cardboard box that looked ordinary enough to ignore. She pulled it down, expecting paperwork. At first, that expectation held. There were folders filled with old documents, envelopes containing receipts from years that no longer mattered, and records kept out of habit rather than necessity. She moved through them methodically, not rushing, not searching, simply clearing the space in front of her. Then she noticed something underneath. A second box, smaller, placed beneath the first layer in a way that suggested it belonged there but was not meant to draw attention. It was not sealed and it was not labeled. It was simply there. She opened it. Inside were receipts, not a few, but dozens, and they did not look random. Restaurant bills, hotel confirmations, spa reservations, and purchases that began to form a pattern the moment she saw them together. The locations were not local. They were scattered across different states, places Derek had mentioned over the years as part of work travel. He had called them conferences, client meetings, industry events, explanations that had always sounded routine. She picked one receipt at random. It was from a resort in Sedona, and the date aligned with a weekend she remembered clearly, a time when Derek had told her he would be away for business. She kept going. Each receipt added to the same pattern, consistent and intentional in a way that removed the possibility of coincidence. This was not overlap. This was planning. Then she found the photographs. They were printed, not stored digitally, not hidden behind passwords or screens, but physically preserved in a way that required intention. That detail mattered. It meant this was not convenience. It was something he had chosen to keep. The images showed Derek and Kayla in different places and in different moments that all carried the same underlying reality. At a vineyard, standing close enough that distance no longer existed. On a beach, positioned in a way that suggested familiarity rather than performance. Across from each other at a restaurant, leaning forward in a way that happens naturally when two people are no longer pretending. This was not casual. This was not accidental. This was a relationship. Marissa stood there for a moment, not reacting outwardly, but processing everything with a level of focus that did not allow distraction. Then she reached for her phone. She did not rush the process. She photographed everything, every receipt, every image, every detail that could later be questioned if it was not captured clearly. She adjusted the angle when necessary, checked the clarity, and made sure each frame was complete and readable. When she finished, she returned everything exactly as she had found it. The same order, the same placement, the same position on the shelf. If Derek ever checked, nothing would appear disturbed. That mattered, because this was no longer about what she knew. It was about what she could prove. She stepped out of the office and closed the door behind her, the movement controlled and deliberate. The hallway felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the situation had shifted into something measurable. She stood there for a moment, then took out her phone and called her attorney. She said she had found something. There was a pause on the other end, not emotional, not surprised, but focused. The question came back directly. How much? Marissa looked toward the closed office door before answering. She said it was more than enough. Once her attorney reviewed what she had found, everything began to move faster, not emotionally, but logistically. There was no shock and no outrage. There was only precision. The explanation was straightforward. The relationship itself would not determine the outcome. Emotion does not divide assets. Documentation does. If marital funds or business resources had been used to support that relationship, then the situation shifted into something else entirely. It became financial misconduct, something that could be measured, something that could be proven. That was where the strategy changed. A forensic accountant was brought in, someone who approached the situation through numbers rather than narrative, focusing only on what could be traced and verified. His role was clear. He followed the money. He matched transactions to timelines. He connected what had been found in that box to what existed in Derek's financial records. In practice, it required time and discipline. Over the next several days, he moved through years of data, reviewing expense reports, company accounts, and credit card statements, building a structure that connected each piece to the next. The conclusion did not require emphasis. Funds had been redirected, not in a way that would immediately attract attention, but consistently enough to create a clear and undeniable pattern. Expenses categorized as business aligned directly with personal travel. Locations matched, dates matched, patterns held. The amount was not extreme, but it was significant. More importantly, it was traceable and difficult to explain away. While that process was unfolding, the reaction from the other side began. Kayla reached out first. Her voice was controlled and measured, structured in a way that suggested she had prepared for the conversation. She did not begin with emotion. She began with strategy. She said Marissa needed to stop. Marissa asked her to be clear. Kayla adjusted, suggesting that things were going too far and that there were other people involved, people who would be affected by what was happening. Employees, business partners, people who had nothing to do with the situation. It was a calculated shift, an attempt to move the focus away from what had been done and onto the consequences of exposing it. Marissa listened without interrupting. When she responded, her tone remained steady. She said she was asking for a fair resolution. Nothing more. Kayla's response sharpened. She said Marissa was trying to destroy him. Marissa did not change her position. She clarified it. She said she was making sure she was not the one left exposed. There was a pause. Then Kayla's tone changed again, moving away from strategy into something more personal. She said Marissa was not as perfect as she believed, and in that moment, the conversation revealed more than it was trying to hide. Kayla's words did not land the way she intended them to, because the shift in tone from control to implication had already revealed more than she realized. And Marissa understood immediately that the conversation had moved from strategy into pressure. The suggestion was not direct, and it was not supported by anything specific, but it was designed to create uncertainty, to introduce the idea that there were things that could surface if the situation continued. Marissa did not interrupt her, and she did not react in a way that would allow that suggestion to gain momentum, because she understood that momentum was the only thing Kayla was trying to build. When Marissa responded, her voice remained even and controlled, and she made it clear that if Kayla wanted to continue that conversation, they could do it in a setting where every word would be documented and examined, and where the implications of what was being said would carry weight. Otherwise, she suggested that Kayla should reconsider what she was trying to imply. The silence that followed was not empty, but measured. And when Kayla spoke again, the control in her voice had already begun to thin. She said Marissa was being vindictive. Marissa did not argue with the word. She replaced it. She said she was being precise. Then she ended the call. Later that evening, Derek tried a different approach, choosing distance instead of confrontation, sending messages that began reasonably and suggested that they could talk, that things could still be handled privately, that there was no reason to escalate the situation. For a brief moment, the tone resembled what it had always been between them, familiar enough to feel almost normal. Then it shifted. The messages became less direct and more suggestive, referencing things that might not look good if everything became public, implying risk without providing detail. Nothing explicit, nothing concrete, just enough to suggest leverage. Marissa did not respond. She forwarded every message to her attorney, preserving the exact language and the order in which it had been sent. The response she received was immediate. She was told to keep everything, because at that point, the pattern was no longer subtle. They were not trying to repair what had been broken. They were trying to control what it would cost them. 2 days later, the situation began to move beyond private conversations. The first shift appeared inside Derek's company, where irregular expenses were flagged during a routine internal review. At first, it looked like something that could be explained, something that would normally be resolved with a simple clarification. But the numbers did not align cleanly. Transactions tied to travel did not match business activity. Locations raised questions, patterns repeated, the kind of questions that do not disappear once they are noticed. By the end of the day, those questions had moved beyond accounting. By the next morning, they reached partners. By the end of the week, they reached people who did not need the full story to understand that something was wrong. Reputation did not collapse loudly. It shifted quietly in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Clients began to hesitate. Projects slowed without being formally canceled. Conversations changed. At the same time, the situation spread into the part of Kayla's life she had tried to keep separate: family. Their mother became aware of the distance first, then of the tension, and eventually of enough detail to understand that something had broken between her daughters in a way that could not be easily repaired. The conversations that followed were not public, but the effects were. Calls became shorter. Messages went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Kayla did not lose everything at once. She lost it gradually, piece by piece, in a way that made it harder to deny. Friends who had once responded immediately began to take longer. Then they stopped responding at all. Not because they openly chose sides, but because silence required less explanation. By the time Derek and Kayla appeared at the house together, the situation had already moved beyond their ability to contain it. Marissa understood that before she opened the door. She was not expecting them, but she was not surprised either, because people tend to return to the place where they believe they still have access when control begins to slip. Kayla spoke first, her tone controlled but thinner than before, asking if they could come in and framing the request as something small, something contained. Marissa stepped aside without argument and let them in. They moved into the living room, where the arrangement of space said more than anything they were about to say. Marissa sat in the chair. They sat on the couch, close enough to remove any ambiguity. Kayla began carefully, speaking about family, about history, about things that still existed if they chose not to destroy them. She mentioned their mother. She mentioned how the situation was already affecting people beyond them. It was an attempt to frame the conversation around consequence rather than cause. Marissa listened without interrupting. When Kayla finished, Marissa asked a single question. She asked what exactly still existed. Kayla hesitated, then answered in general terms, referring to their shared history, their family, and the connection that had existed between them for years. Marissa acknowledged the answer but did not accept it. She reminded her of the reality that had existed beneath those conversations, of the years they had spent sitting across from each other while something else was happening at the same time. She asked her again to be specific. Kayla did not answer. Derek leaned forward instead, attempting to shift the conversation into something practical, something that could still be managed. He spoke about the business, about the employees, about the consequences of letting the situation continue in a way that would involve more people. Marissa listened, then responded without raising her voice. She said that if he was concerned about the business, he should have considered that before using it in ways that could not be explained. He insisted that the situation was being taken out of context. She held his gaze and told him that he would have the opportunity to explain that context in a setting where it mattered. That was the moment the structure of the conversation broke. Kayla's control slipped, and her tone changed completely. She said Marissa would regret this. She said there were things she did not understand. For a brief moment, the words carried weight, because uncertainty can sound like power when it is delivered with confidence. But confidence does not create truth. Marissa stood, walked to the door, and told them the conversation was over. Neither of them moved immediately, as if waiting for something else to happen, something that would shift the balance back in their favor. Nothing did. Derek stood first. Kayla followed. As she walked past, she did not look at Marissa, and that absence of acknowledgement revealed more than anything she had said. They left without another word. And for the first time since everything began, they left without a strategy, only reaction. The next phase was already in motion. The mediation was scheduled. And by the time it arrived, the outcome would no longer depend on what anyone said. By the time the mediation date arrived, the outcome had already begun to form long before anyone took their seat at that table, because the process had moved beyond emotion and into something that could no longer be negotiated through words alone. Patricia arrived early, placing her files in front of her with quiet precision, reviewing each section one last time. Not because she needed to, but because preparation had already been completed, and this was simply the final confirmation. Marissa sat beside her, composed in a way that no longer required effort, not holding herself together and not suppressing anything, but existing in a state where nothing that happened next would change what she had already decided. Derek entered with his attorney a few minutes later, his posture controlled but heavier than before, carrying the weight of something that had already begun to shift beyond his control. He did not look at her immediately, and when he finally did, it was brief and measured, as if even eye contact now required calculation. Kayla arrived shortly after with her own attorney, her presence steady on the surface, but the absence of certainty visible in the way she moved and in the way she avoided unnecessary motion. From the outside, the room looked ordinary. A conference table, neutral walls, documents arranged in neat stacks, people preparing to discuss numbers. That is how collapse looks when it is complete, structured, and controlled, rather than loud or chaotic. The mediator opened the session with a standard explanation, outlining the purpose as resolution rather than conflict, agreement rather than blame, framing everything in language designed to remove emotion from what had been built entirely on it. Derek's attorney spoke first, presenting an updated offer that was structured to appear balanced, with revised financial terms and adjusted conditions that were carefully positioned to suggest reason and fairness. Marissa listened without interruption, not because she was considering the offer, but because she understood that what mattered was not what was being said, but what had not yet been introduced. When the presentation ended, Patricia allowed a moment of silence to settle across the table, letting the absence of noise create space for what would come next. Then she moved. She slid a document forward, aligning it carefully so that it faced Derek's attorney, placing it in the center without explanation. It was the forensic report, detailed and structured in a way that removed interpretation entirely, page after page of dates, transactions, and patterns that aligned too precisely to be dismissed. The shift in the room was immediate, not dramatic, but tight, controlled, and irreversible. Derek's attorney began reading quickly, scanning for entry points, for something that could be challenged or reframed, but the pace slowed as the structure revealed itself, as the consistency became impossible to ignore. Kayla glanced at her lawyer, who had gone still, not reacting but recalculating. The mediator began asking questions, moving carefully through the data, isolating specific entries, specific dates, transactions categorized as business expenses that aligned directly with personal travel. Derek's attorney responded where possible, attempting to introduce context, to create distance between the numbers and their meaning. But numbers do not rely on narrative, they define it. Then the moment came when the mediator referenced the Sedona trip, isolating it from the rest of the report and asking for clarification in a tone that remained neutral but carried weight. Kayla answered too quickly, saying it was a work trip and that there had been meetings. The second question followed immediately, asking whether she had been aware of that trip at the time. Kayla hesitated, not long but long enough to change the outcome. Then she said they had discussed it. That was enough. Patricia reached into her folder and placed a photograph on the table, aligning it carefully so that it could not be ignored. The image showed Kayla standing in front of a resort in Sedona, relaxed and unaware, captured at the exact time Derek had claimed to be somewhere else entirely. The timestamp was visible. The location was embedded. No explanation was required. No argument was available. Derek's attorney leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that signaled a shift from strategy to calculation because the situation could no longer be defended. A break was called. In the hallway, Patricia handed Marissa a glass of water and asked how she felt. Marissa answered without hesitation. She said she was ready. Patricia nodded because readiness meant only one thing at that point. They were going to settle. When they returned to the room, the tone had changed completely. There was no longer any attempt to frame the situation or soften it. There were no strategies left to apply. There were only terms. The house would be transferred fully to Marissa. No buyout required. The savings would be divided with adjustments that accounted for the funds that had been redirected. Additional compensation would be included. Legal fees would be structured to reflect responsibility. Every detail was reviewed. Every condition was documented. Derek signed without speaking. Kayla did not look up. When it ended, there was no acknowledgement, no attempt to soften what had just been decided. There was only silence, not the kind that carries tension, but the kind that remains when there is nothing left to negotiate. But what happened after mattered more. Within weeks, the consequences stopped looking like consequences and started looking like reality. Derek did not lose everything in a single moment. He lost it in increments. Clients who had once trusted him stopped returning calls. Partners became careful, then distant, then unavailable. Projects slowed without explanation. Nothing collapsed publicly, which made it worse, because absence leaves no argument to fight against. Kayla tried to hold on to what remained of her world, but the spaces she once filled began to close around her. Conversations shortened. Invitations disappeared. People did not confront her. They adjusted around her. Silence did the work no accusation ever could. Marissa did not follow any of it closely. She did not need updates. She did not need confirmation. Because by then, the outcome was no longer something she was waiting to see. It was something she had already decided. Months later, the house felt different in a way she did not have to question. It was not emptier and it was not quieter. It was clear. Every room belonged to her in a way it never had before. There was nothing left to analyze, nothing left to prove, nothing left to protect. And that was the difference. Because Derek did not lose her when he told the truth. He lost her the moment he believed she would never look closely enough to see it. He lost her in every quiet conversation where he thought silence was safety. He lost her in all the years he mistook her trust for blindness. And by the time he finally said it out loud, there was nothing left for him to lose. Because she had already left long before he realized he was the only one still standing inside that life. And this time, there was no version of it left for him to return to. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in the main character's place. And subscribe to Sinner Stories so you never miss a new video. If you're enjoying our stories and would like to support the channel, we'd truly appreciate your help. Your support allows us to create more original content like this. You'll find the link in the description below.